Good evening. Wow. Richard, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the introduction for me to so many things in my life and career, and I'm incredibly grateful. Richard's been a friend and a kind of mentor and guide, and was my inspiration for looking at issues of happiness, because of course he pioneered this question for economists and told us how important, and helped me to delve into it. And it's a long relationship and an incredibly thrilling one. And it's really thrilling to be with you. I feel a lot of energy in the room, and I hope we have a good discussion, because I actually don't want to give a lecture, but I'm happy to talk about lots of things, and things that are on my mind, and I hope especially things that are on your mind: children, Elon Musk, education, and a few other topics. We can definitely all get them into one good sentence. How Elon Musk educated children to take his Hyperloop as they made their way to his SpaceX shot to Mars. How about that? We'll talk about what he has in mind. Incredibly inventive, by the way. A little bit crazy sometimes. Unfortunately, I was not happy with his call last week for intercity rocket space travel, because unfortunately that would blow up the carbon budget for all the good things he's doing with Tesla. He would quickly end as we all flew our 3-minute flights to Tokyo or to Los Angeles or whatever. So I didn't quite know what he had in mind for that one. But it is a very interesting, strange, weird time. In some ways, we have it so good it's unbelievable, in that the technology, the wealth, the ability to solve problems, the scientific breakthroughs, just unreal, actually. And for me, once a week, Friday, comes my issue of Nature magazine for the week. And any issue that you open up, it is a miracle of how much knowledge, how much advance, how much sophistication, how much insight is taking place. And I'm also thrilled to know that as I'm leafing through the pages, it's very exciting, the feeling that I know that Donald Trump is doing the same thing that moment. And he's having the same impulse, that harnessing that scientific knowledge for the human good, this is really the highest purpose of politics. So that's what makes me feel good on Fridays. Then I go have a stiff drink, and no, actually the weird thing in our lives is really the incredible knowledge, the incredible productivity of the economy, really the remarkable sophistication, the fact that a guy like Elon Musk, who I happen to know and is a genius, and he's fun to listen to, and he's unbelievable, and he has his own rocket company, which is really cool. And not just that, I mean, unbelievably cool. It's one thing to have your own car company, that I understand, but your own rocket company, SpaceX, and you land the ship in the middle of a deck. I'm sure everybody's seen it, right? Has everybody watched? Okay, if you haven't, go home, type Elon Musk, SpaceX, landing, where the thing comes down like a pencil. The rocket lands in the middle of the deck, in the middle of the ocean. It's unbelievable. Okay, so that's one end of the spectrum, kind of glorious. And then the other end of the spectrum, the far distant other side of the spectrum, is named Donald Trump. And that's the weirdness of our age. How do we get that? How do we put problems in front of ourselves that are so strange? You could, if you had written this as a novel, my son's a novelist, no one would have bought that novel. That's too weird. Come on. And I think we're doing this all the time. Think of all the energy that's going into Brexit right now, and all the politics and all the social tensions and upheavals over something that, frankly, even if you're in favor or not in favor, whatever, what a waste of time. What a waste of time compared to... And watching, I happen to love Barcelona and love the Ramblas and love Catalonia, but it is odd. Really, it's odd to invest so much energy right now into the question of whether the Spanish state, which dates back roughly to 1492, so we're something like 525 years of that, whether this is really the moment that it's so desperate that all the forces need to be put to this and people need to be banged on their heads and so on. I don't get it exactly. Well, but it is a question, and it is the argument is it's democracy. It may be true, but then I ask, why is that what democracy does, given the things that actually we usefully could be doing?
It's misinformed democracy, I think.
It's
misinformed democracy.
Yeah, well, it could be misinformed. That it's misinformed democracy. And another view is the view expressed by my guru in this, Professor E.O. Wilson of Harvard. Have people read Professor Wilson's books? Do you know the name? Professor Wilson, Edward Wilson, is one of the great evolutionary biologists in the world, and he's a Harvard evolutionary biologist, and an incredibly wonderful, wonderful man, and he's written really great fundamental texts. He's the world expert on, among other things, on ants. But he used ants as social animals to understand in profound depth how societies work, and was able to use that as a stepping stone to inventing the field of sociobiology back in 1975, I think it was, with his great book. And then an absolutely wonderful book that I really recommend to you called Consilience, which was one of the most important books for me in my life in reading it. Consilience is a word meaning jumping together, and the idea was that all knowledge is consilient, so the social sciences and the physical sciences would eventually merge, and the humanities and the social sciences and the physical sciences would become consilient. Well, Wilson, thinking about humanity, society, biology, our fate, summarized our fate, I think, in a pretty pithy way when he said, "So we have stumbled into the 21st century with our Stone Age emotions, our medieval institutions, and our godlike technology." And I think that that's also a pretty good summary. So it's not only misinformed democracy, it's in our heads in a lot of ways. Our human psychology, know thyself, or to thine own self be true, or know thyself, as Socrates said, we're only beginning, really, in a deep way, to be able to do that. But now we know, in part thanks to Ed Wilson's research, and even more to Charles Darwin's insights, that our psyches were fashioned not for systematic clockwork purposes, but through a rather long and circuitous and accidental evolutionary path, and that our human natures were formed on the African savanna, and we really do literally carry with us our Stone Age emotions. And part of the work of action for happiness, or for any of us in trying to be happy, is to understand what does it mean to have those Stone Age emotions, and living in the 21st century, how do we control our emotions, understand ourselves in a way that is conducive to our own well-being, but also how do we do it in a way that adds up in a democracy or in society to not ending up in these terrible messes. And I think that this probably is actually the fundamental point, that we are a bag of contradictions and complexities as human beings. Human institutions are a reflection of us and our human nature. We know from the great sages and from all of human history how things can go right and things can go wrong. And it's our challenge every generation to try to figure out our part to make things go right. That's how I figure it. And I have also come to understand better than I would have done 40 years ago that there is never a moment of victory. There is only the progress of carrying things along and hopefully delivering them to our kids in a way that is manageable, and then they can pick up the challenge. And actually, no matter how rich we get, though it can solve many remarkable problems, it doesn't solve the problem of human nature unless we work to solve that problem as well. And that's why what you're doing and what Action for Happiness is doing and what we're doing tonight in thinking about this, I think is really, really essential. I came here at the beginning of the week to give a lecture at LSE in my absolutely favorite lecture place in the whole world, which is the old theater in the old building. If you don't know it, walk in sometime and take a look. But there's no more fun place, actually, to give a lecture for a couple of reasons. One, it's just a beautiful, absolutely beautiful hall. And second, the students are completely wonderful because they're coming from all over the world and they're looking at you the whole time. And there's just a tremendous amount of excitement in that, and I feel that tonight. And I started with a quotation by John Maynard Keynes, which also I think he's always good for a quote. Really a smart guy, by the way. And I've always felt very happy that he's accompanied me on every step of my career, because he's one of those writers that when you read them, you feel, okay, you're telling me something. I'm not just reading a book, you're helping me in my real problem right now. Maynard, what do you think? What should I do? Oh, okay, I see on page 214. That's really helpful, thank you. So that's how I feel about reading John Maynard Keynes, and he helped me really, really deeply in my work in Bolivia in the 1980s and in Poland, with very practical advice that had nothing to do with Bolivia or Poland, but was very much how to understand a political situation and a political crisis and how to address it with humanity, which I think is very important because, remember, I'm digressing, but he said at the end of World War I, be nice. Don't have the brutal Carthaginian peace at the end of World War I. It will come back to haunt us. The world's more fragile. If you're not nice, things will come back to hit you hard. And of course, we were never hit harder than in the rebound of Germany after World War I with the World War II. And so Keynes had that way of getting to the crux of an incredibly complex situation. So what I quoted him is very interesting for us, and I think for our time, because he wrote an essay, which is one of my favorite essays, which If you haven't read it, this is your second homework assignment tonight. Go home and read it. It's called The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And it was an essay that he wrote in 1930 in the depths of the Great Depression. And it's this wonderful essay which is all about what we need to talk about tonight. So you're in the Great Depression, and he writes an essay about what the world will be like at the time of his grandchildren. And he has, because he was so great, honestly, to be able to see, he says, we're passing through a difficulty right now. But the underlying truth of our time is that there's technological advancement. And he noted the oddity that from the Roman times until around 1700, there was almost no technological advancement. Very little, he said. All the technologies that somebody in England in 1700 would have known had actually been known to the Romans. How odd that was. But then came an explosion of knowledge. Then came Newton. Then came the birth of science-based technology. Then came, for an economist, James Watt, who invented the steam engine, who set off the Industrial Revolution with that invention. And what Keynes said in 1930 was that process of underlying growth of knowledge, just what I told you about reading Nature magazine each Friday, that is going to continue. And so we'll have our ups and downs, but underlying it all will be this advance of technique, of technology, of productivity, of new goods and services, of what Ed Wilson called the godlike technologies of the 21st century. And so Keynes said by the time of the grandchildren, what he called the economic problem, and what he meant by that, the problem of age-old struggle of humanity to feed itself, to have basic provision, to lift beyond poverty, to not be vulnerable to famine. He said that problem will be gone in our societies. And I love it for the fact that he wrote it in the depths of the worst economic crisis. He wrote it with incredible confidence, and he was completely right. So we reached the year 2000 with no extreme poverty in the UK or the US or anywhere in Europe. Not that there weren't poor people, but there was so much productivity that if people were hungry or destitute, it was on us, not on the economic system. It was something crazy because the average, and not only the average level, but for almost all people, even people we call poor, the kind of poverty that had afflicted humanity for ever and ever up until recent times was basically gone. So Keynes asked the question in this essay, after making these observations and making this very unusual prediction, he said, what will we do with ourselves? We're all going to have so much time on our hands that we won't know what to do with ourselves. He said we'll finally be beyond that time when this quest for money's sake, which he called a semi-pathological morbidity, would be over so that we could get on with other things, but he wondered what we'd do when our work week was only 5 hours or 10 hours a week. Okay, certain things didn't work out yet, like he said. I don't think he's so wrong, and I spent a lot of my lecture on Monday explaining that now people retire, now people have long vacations, now people, the work we do for lucky, and I consider myself very lucky, is not arduous physical labor. And it's true, I have not broken a sweat from physical work in my job ever in my profession. One time. which is, as a development economist, I spent a morning weeding in the fields with an old woman who was weeding in Kenya to see what it was like, and I could barely stand up again. And she has done that for 70 years, every day. And so that was the one time I broke a sweat, and the rest was pretty easygoing. And so in some sense, I think Keynes is more right than we sometimes realize, even in our current state. But what he wasn't right about somehow is all the problems that we still have, that we're not able to recognize even our wealth, to enjoy it, and to not have fights to the death, literally to the death, and to have, say, the most powerful, rich country in the world, which is my own, crazy at war, fighting everybody, killing ourselves, having massacres. It's incredible, actually. The U.S. averages $60,000 per person per year. We have everything. And we've elected a nut who says that our biggest problem is America first, America first. First of all, that's such a vulgar, ugly idea to begin with. But how do you get to be so rich and then so needy and so disgusting and so ugly and so violent? So this is really why the problems are mostly in our heads, and why we need to understand our situation accurately. And if we do, then my feeling is, and I'll just give you a few minutes of example of that, we can really solve a lot if we get our heads together. We can end poverty, we can save millions of lives, we can stop stupid wars, we can help still impoverished people, very few in our countries, but few, but a lot abroad, get out of that state of impoverishment. We could do wonderful things. And one of the most fun things possible in the world is actually to work on that. What could be more fun than the idea that we could really solve some of these big problems if we put our minds to it? So let me just give you a couple of minutes about that and then throw it open for discussion, because I don't want to just rant on about all of these things. We're rich today. That's what Keynes told us. By the way, Keynes told us we'll be so rich that economists, what will they do anyway? And you may wonder, what have they ever done other than Richard? But he said, wouldn't it be wonderful if then, because of the modest role, economists would just be recognized as competent as dentists, was his closing line. And that would be wonderful. I hope there's some dentists here who can appreciate that was a true meant sentiment. Let's just be able to be helpful, good craftsmen in solving practical problems to help people find answers to problems. So my view is that we have these near godlike technologies, as Wilson says. We have, in a way, come close to ending the economic problem, as Keynes said, really surprisingly close, even on a global scale. And just to give you a glimmer of that, back in 1776, which was a really important year, you'll recall, because a few things happened that year, but the most important of which was that James Watt patented the steam engine, and that was the real takeoff. And then you know the second thing that happened in 1776, probably, very famous for a very famous document, The Wealth of Nations, was published that year. And there was the Declaration of Independence, but that was a very little weird, actually. That was a little bit like Brexit today. Probably not necessary in the long term, a lot of waste of energy. It would have been, I would like to have a queen rather than Donald Trump, frankly. So I have become a monarchist in my recent years. That's the truth. But in any event, back then, everybody was facing the economic problem. In the quotes of John Maynard Keynes, everyone was poor. Even rich people were poor by standards that we know it. Even kings and queens were poor by the standards we know it. But probably 95% of humanity in 1776 faced a possibility of famine. Probably today, that's 5% of the world. At least if we don't destroy the environment in the process. So going from that situation and a situation where everybody was poor and where a couple bad years of crops could lead to hunger that we know of, say, in France, that led Marie Antoinette to her famous statements about let them eat bread, and the French Revolution, or led to the Irish famine in the middle of the 19th century. That kind of affliction, which was pervasive anywhere, even in the richest part of the world, has largely disappeared except in very specific parts of the world today. That's an amazing achievement. If you measure what we call extreme poverty, which the World Bank is the scorekeeper of, it's under 10% of the world population today. And that's an honest score. That's not a fake number. That's a real reflection of the fact there are a lot of poor people by standards of rich countries, billions, but living at the brink of survival, not so many anymore. And while 10% of the world's population is 750 million people, so it's a lot, and it's a shame, and it's a disgrace that people are still at that level of suffering in a world of so much wealth. It really is down from 95%. And so that's really a lot of progress. So for me, that's been the starting point of the observation for quite a long time, the feeling quite a long time, that if we just put our heads to it, if we don't lose our heads by doing stupid things, most stupidly going to war, but actually focus a bit of attention on the poor, on the vulnerable, on the environment, on our needs to hang everything together, we're really close to completing Keynes' story, not only in Britain or the United States or Western Europe, but actually in the whole world. We're just not so far away from being able to end poverty and deprivation. We could really bring poverty to an end. Wow. We could if we wanted to, and I can't figure out in a deep way, although I could give you hours of rambling explanation, we could save, if we put our minds to it, for an imperceptibly small amount of money, maybe $40 or $50 billion a year for the next few years. We could save at least 5 million lives per year of children and bring the death rates down in the poor countries to the same levels as the rich countries, extend life expectancy by at least 10 or 15 years in poor countries, and bring physical well-being to hundreds of millions of people. And the amount that I'm talking about is 15 or 20 days of Pentagon spending, for example, or less than half of what we spent for years in fighting a war in Afghanistan that you can't even figure out what the hell do we think we're even doing. But for that, we could have saved millions of lives around the world and changed the fate of communities of hundreds of millions of people. So that's what economics has told me the good part of economics is basically long division, multiplication, some arithmetic to realize that when you're so rich, you can solve a lot of problems if you put a little bit of time and effort to it. And a lot of my work as a technical economist has been to suggest some practical ways to do things. And all of it, by the way, because I think Richard would agree, economists don't really know anything except what people with a lot of technical knowledge tell us. So we don't have technical knowledge, but we're good at long division and multiplication. And so we can add up numbers, we can put pound signs in front of them or dollar signs in front of them, and if you're a macroeconomist, you always say, and that's not so much, because you divide by $125 trillion of world output, which is what our rich world makes every year right now. And so we could do just about anything we wanted. And as an example, a wonderful, wonderful late professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine took me aside one day, a man named Chris Curtis, who was a great malariologist, and he said to me, Jeff, we have these bed nets. I said, what are those? He said, well, you have bed nets, and they're treated with insecticide, and they are protective against malaria. And I said, how do you know, Chris? He said, well, I've been doing the field trials. I said, are you sure? He said, Jeff, it really works. Okay, that for me that's good enough. When you have a real authority, a real decent person, great integrity, a great experimentalist, and he explains to you it works. So I bet on him, which was a good thing to do, but when you go around and every other expert says that's good, that's right, then you have a lot of confidence if you're a generalist like I am. So I looked at the costs of these bed nets. They cost $5, so say 3.5 pounds, and 2 kids sleep under them. And they last 5 years. Are you kidding? So it's like 50 cents per kid per year, US. And then poor people, however, can't afford them. And so they're dying of malaria, the kids. So my feeling was, wouldn't the world be a little bit happier if each person in the rich world gave $2 a year, and there are 1 billion of us in the rich world, and that created a fund of $2 billion per year, and that was devoted to helping poor people get bed nets, and when the bed nets sometimes failed, the medicine to cure the kid. Well, I had one of the longest fights of my career for about 7 years. Sachs, you're an idiot. You can't just give that stuff away. And I said, why not? No, they got to buy it. It's not sustainable. I said, are you kidding? $2 from the rich world every year. Not sustainable? What are you talking about? Anyway, it took 7 years. Bill Gates said to me, that's nonsense. I don't want to hear more about bed nets at one point. Then he ended up funding a lot of the bed nets, fortunately, and did a wonderful job with that. Okay, upshot of the story. In 2008, the new Secretary General of the UN, and I was his advisor, Ban Ki-moon, said we should give away bed nets. And then 1 billion bed nets were given out. And millions of lives have been saved, actually. At almost no cost, so tiny. You know what $2 billion is? I told you, it's less than 1 day of US military spending per year. I mean, you get 1 year's worth of malaria control from 1 day of Pentagon spending. So I spent a lot of my life begging the Pentagon to take a long weekend. Just relax. No one's going to invade. Go have a vacation. And we could end malaria. We could control AIDS. We could do all these wonderful things. So here is the real point. We have so much knowledge. It's amazing. And for me, it's an unbelievable privilege. It's the great privilege to talk to a Chris Curtis or talk to an Ed Wilson, who is not only a great ant specialist and sociobiologist, but is one of the world. He basically popularized the term biodiversity and is one of the world's greatest conservationists. Explain to you the things we could do. Then you meet the politicians. It's a weird way we've organized society. It's really strange, actually. So much knowledge. And then that. So it's really something to ponder, actually. And one of the biggest problems is, how do you get all that thick trunk lines of knowledge into the places where people who make decisions work? For Chris Curtis, by the way, here London had one of the world's greatest malariologists. And he called me, he told me this because he said, Jeff, I said, Chris, go tell the health minister here about this. He said, I can't reach the health minister. I said, what do you mean? You're at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. This is the world center for tropical medicine knowledge. Jeff, I can't go just to talk to the health minister. I could, given my role at the UN, but how weird that I was an intermediary. But this is really a fundamental problem. What I can tell you, surely, is we're rich, and we don't have to worry so much about that. We're incredibly productive. We're not productive because greed makes us productive. We're productive because our technology is really, really great. Some of it emerged from greed. Some of it emerged from scientific research that was curiosity-driven or passion-driven. But the real reason we're rich is that the know-how is vast. There's no shortage of resources to solve the world's great problems. We're not in a struggle for survival in that way, but in our heads we are. And maybe that's a problem. In our heads we are, that's one thing. And second, we can't get the information from where it exists in the pages of Nature magazine and Science magazine into real decision making. And I'll tell you my real true experience on this, because I've been now for 17 years the advisor to the Secretary General of the UN. I sit in on a lot of interesting meetings. I see these people close up. I see them talk to each other. It's pretty fascinating, actually. Really weird sometimes, by the way. Really weird. But what you know is my job is to advise on how to achieve sustainable development, how to end poverty, how to reduce economic inequality, and how to do it in a way that will not destroy the environment. And the basic idea is simple: mobilize resources and good technology and invest in it to make sure that it reaches those in need. So if it's climate change, shift from coal, oil, and gas to wind, solar, nuclear, other zero carbon energy sources. It's actually not so complicated. Then, how does that knowledge go from these super sophisticated engineers who understand that? Then there's me, who understands a little bit of it because I've heard it explained 50 times, so I kind of can fake it. And then I advise somebody who maybe has never talked to the systems engineers, and then to the next one. And the truth is that for almost all our issues, say malaria control or decarbonization of the energy system. You could fill a library with super sophisticated work. Then it gets boiled down into usually a volume like this. Then it gets summarized maybe in a World Bank annual report. Then it gets turned into a 20-page policy brief. Then it gets turned into a paragraph in a speech. Then you have the heads of state meeting with each other, and it becomes one sentence, usually not right. And if you're semi-expert, you're in the room, but you're not allowed to talk because the two heads are the only ones that are allowed to talk, and then there are 18 people on each side. The two heads talk with each other. They don't quite get it right, but you can't say, sorry, sir, not quite right, but good try. Or that's the last time you say that. The only time you only get halfway out of the sentence. So that really is the puzzle of how we can bring the knowledge to bear. Then there are two more problems, and I'll stop here and open it up for discussion because I'm just, unfortunately, just scratching the surface of this. There really are two problems. One, there are, unfortunately, real people with real interests and real power who don't want to solve problems, who want to maintain problems. For example, there aren't too many people who go out of their way to continue malaria, for example. There are a lot of people who don't care, never heard of it, why should I care, and so forth. There are a lot of people who have ignorant ideas and never had the chance to talk to Chris Curtis and carry around a lot of fantasy false information. But there are few that are out there trying to promote malaria. But a different kind of problem is climate change, where the real technical problem for us is how to change from the economy that James Watt invented with the steam engine, which was a fabulous invention, one of maybe the most important invention in the last 2,000 years, because it made the modern world possible, it made industrialization possible. But it turned out to have this side effect that when you burn coal or oil or gas, carbon dioxide goes into the air and warms the climate. So it's just a damn side effect. It's just bad luck. Nothing immoral about coal. Coal's a great thing. The problem is, though, that the quantum mechanics of CO2 make that molecule absorb infrared radiation, so it vibrates. And instead of letting the infrared radiation from Earth go out to space, it captures it in vibrating CO2 molecules, which are now 405 molecules for every million molecules in the atmosphere. And that acts like a blanket that warms the planet. So just bad luck for us. Because maybe James Watt discovered a fuel source that wasn't a greenhouse gas, but he didn't. He discovered one that a century later was discovered to be a greenhouse gas. Okay, now we know that we have to move away from it. It's pretty clear. And if you got 20 engineers together, in about 2 hours, they could design a pretty good transition for you. And if you got any 20 engineers together and gave them in 20 different rooms, they would design pretty much the same transition, by the way. There aren't too many ways to get to decarbonization. So what's the problem? In some places, no big problem. Sweden's doing it, boom. Norway's going to do it, Denmark's going to do it. But the United States has to pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement. Not only because the guy's a dunderhead ignoramus and sociopath, which he is, all of those things, but that's not the main reason why he made that statement. The main reason he made that statement is that 22 Republican senators came to him the week before and said, make the statement because we're funded. They didn't necessarily explain it, but it was pretty obvious. We're funded by the oil industry. This will not be good for us. We want to continue to earn profits. We want to frack natural gas and write on all the posters, that's clean, but it ain't. It's green, but it ain't. We want to subsidize the coal industry even though it's bankrupt and dying as it needs to. Because we need to make a little more money because we're only worth $50 billion. So we have these two miscreants, David and Charles Koch, K-O-C-H, who are just nasty people, really bad people. They're each worth $50 billion. They own a lot of pipelines and refineries, and they spread their money around so that congressmen go tell idiot presidents, do this, and then they do that. So that's another reason, that's one more reason why things don't work, is that we get blockades from powerful, narrow interests of really insanely greedy people. If we could get David and Charles Koch to Action for Happiness for a couple days, you'd save the climate. It's a policy recommendation. Then there's one more problem, and I want to end here and come back to human nature, because there are many problems with our human nature, we know. It's all so much more complex in how we work than we could ever have imagined. It's actually only in recent decades in all the course of human history that we're beginning to understand the neuroscience of it all. It was completely impenetrable. You could hold up a brain of a last poor Yorick, but what did it mean? We had no idea of how any of it functioned until the painstaking work and the incredible breakthroughs of recent neuroscience, but we still don't know a lot. And so even as hard as we think, we're impenetrable to ourselves. There's no way that you can think hard and have any clue as to what's really happening biophysically in our brains. We have no insight into how we function in that way. So the sages have told us behaviorally that fact for a long time, that it's all very complicated, and so we get a lot of things wrong. And so all wisdom of great philosophy for 2,500 years was not abstract. It was, watch out, you're trouble to yourself. You know, you can chase after things that you think are going to make you happy, and they're not going to make you happy at all. You can get addicted to things that are going to end up causing misery. You're prone to all sorts of bad accidents, and that's why all of the sages, from the Buddha, Jesus, Aristotle, who is kind of my guru in this, and others, gave us a warning. And Aristotle I really like. Just don't go to extremes. Avoid the edges, you know? That's basically the Nicomachean Ethics, which is behave yourself. And don't go for, you don't have to beat yourself on the back, but don't lead a sybaritic life. It's smart. That's what he was telling his son in that book. And it's basically very, not so different from what Polonius was saying. A little bit smarter, I think, from Aristotle. Okay, that's our one part of our human nature, is don't get caught up in all of the misdirections, what is now called the failures of affective forecasting, meaning we don't really know what's going to make us happy ahead of time because we're prone to all sorts of mistakes. And Aristotle, he said, you need good mentors, you need good education, and you need good habit formation. That was his formula. So his formula was learn to be good, and in his thinking, good was virtuous, erete in Greek. Be virtuous. How do you become virtuous? Be mentored by somebody virtuous. For me, that was my dad, so he taught me a lot. Having a role model of someone who was wonderful, had good values. Without that, very, very hard. Learn at school. Study, but then schools have to teach ethics, not as some crazy side course, but as what is a good life? How can you achieve it? Be careful. Don't get, and it's not abstractions, it's very practical. Practical living. And third, for Aristotle, was habit formation. Being good builds on itself. And I really like this idea also. And the concept is disposition. That instead of being good because you know it's the right thing to do, you're good it becomes your natural disposition to be good. And for Aristotle, that was through habit. And it's different in German philosophy with the Kantian philosophy. You're good because you know that's the wrong, you must not do that. You have a duty to be good. You have to follow the categorical imperative. Well, what you should do is pretty much the same thing for Aristotle and for Kant. But for Kant, it is follow the responsibility. And for Aristotle is grow into being a good person, a virtuous person, which I think is very, very good advice. Okay, but there's another part of morality that I want to end this little explanation on that for me is important, and it comes back to this question of what is our human nature, what do we know about ourselves? And it comes to this question of what's wrong with democracy also, or what's wrong with governance, period. We do have a lot of understanding now, and Action for Happiness is both exploring and cultivating it. We know we have a tremendous capacity for altruism, for doing good, and so on. I absolutely believe that. But we also have in the same psyche and for solid evolutionary biological reasons, we have a capacity to do tremendous harm. And that's because the flip side of learning to cooperate within the in-group was also learning to fight the other. And I do believe, and it's Ed Wilson's idea, but it was Darwin's idea also, and basically now a finding of a tremendous amount of psychological demonstration that we're easily primed to focus on our identity and to form an us versus other perspective, and that we can easily be made to hate the other, and that's not incidental. That's actually probably as deeply driven into our psyches and our human nature as the capacity to do good within our group. And that's really important for us to understand, how primed we are to hate not another individual, because we're not, but we're primed to hate the other group. And what psychologists have shown is how easy it is to define a group. If a teacher says all the children wearing blue are now part of this group, they will hate all the kids who happen to have worn green coming into school. And that's literally what many psychological experiments show, that groups that have no meaning at all, what letter your name starts with, or primed by a question that you're asked, can pull apart our society from being a sense of common purpose to a sense of very deep division. And for me, this is really an even bigger problem than all the problems that I talked about up until now, all the institutional failures, all the difficulties of getting the pipeline from knowledge to action, all of the problems of vested interests. Probably the biggest problem, I believe, in this world that we face is our deep human nature for us versus them. And the reason it's so deep is that war is really awful. And us versus them is the prelude to conflict. And our capacity for conflict is an unending challenge for us of control. And it takes a really profound understanding and a really profound conscious self-control to overcome emotions and to overcome a deep instinct to not go to war. And we're constantly, in my view, facing that problem, which is why it's really a bad idea to put dunderheads into power. Not just dunderheads, malignant, narcissist sociopaths. Because they should be getting help and having a nice quiet life and golfing, and not anywhere near a place where they could actually do some damage. So that was a really bad mistake, and I'm here to apologize on behalf of the American people. But we really need to get this right and clear. I have a rule that if it worked, if it were implemented, would keep peace forever, at least for America. My rule is you're not allowed to bomb another country unless you can name at least 2 cities in it. Americans are so bad at geography that it would be the end of war. But we don't even use that rule. We know that Iran is evil and Saudi Arabia is good, or was it the other way around? I can't remember, but whichever it is, we should bomb them. Well, which one? It doesn't matter. We need to bomb them. And that's really our biggest problem. And of course, we've lived through it so many times, and I'll end on a bleak note as I turn it open to you. We're at the 100th anniversary of World War I these years. It's driven me a little bit batty since 2014 till now, because we're so close to it again. And in 2010, maybe I'll end with a little digression again of Keynes. One more assignment: the opening pages of The Economic Consequences of the Peace. That's the book that Keynes wrote in 1919, where he said, don't be so hard on Germany, you'll create a backlash. An absolutely phenomenal book, written a few blocks from here in Russell Square. And with trying to explain, don't create the seeds of the next disaster. But in that book, he opens with, and he's also the greatest writer in our profession that we've had. He writes about lying in bed in the morning and ordering stocks and bonds from all over the world, and how effortless it was in 1910 and how glorious the world was. Not that everyone could do it, but Keynes could do it. And saying that the world was at the birth of this great scientific revolution. Remember, 1905 was special relativity equals MC squared, proof of the atomic structure in Einstein's proof of Brownian motion, and so on. It's unbelievable breakthroughs. And yet, 9 years later, complete carnage, destroying a whole generation of this country, destroying a whole generation of Europe, then collapse, Great Depression, Hitler, World War II, the Holocaust, 30 years that had nothing to do with human potential, only destruction in that period. And the reason I have shuddered for the last 3 years is, first, I feel like 2017 is like 1910, Look at this glorious science. Look at this wonder. Look at this global possibilities. Look at all we can do in the world. Because that was the feeling in 1910. Another feeling in 1910 is that's inevitable. You know, we're on a path of progress. And how unbelievably fragile it is. And then the worst part of it is that historians have spent 100 years now trying to understand how World War I happened. Why? And the answer is there is no explanation. There is what you call a TikTok account. You can tell the events minute to minute in how the war led up, how the Archduke's driver took the wrong turn, backed up in the wrong lane. The assassin suddenly these kids found themselves facing the Archduke and his wife, and they took the shots. And then Austria demanded that Serbia follow a certain response, which was humiliating. And Serbia said no, and Russia came to their defense, and Germany came to the defense, blah, 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 and suddenly the whole generation's destroyed. And it's a lot of us versus them. It's all about they're going to destroy us, we have to act first, if we don't do this, this is going to happen. Okay, you can understand the dynamics, but what's the deep reason at a time of progress, at a time of rising incomes, at a time of prosperity, that suddenly you had a conflagration? It's not true that it was because of the death of capitalism or, Lenin's ideas that the system was failing. Bullshit. There was nothing fundamentally wrong that led to this disaster. So that's where I want to end, actually, in this sense. Look, we can solve all the problems in front of us. First, we need to take away the little impediments that are driving us crazy, because we're constantly creating problems that are not even problems, that take our time and energy. Second, we need to understand how much knowledge and wisdom there is in the world, and how to cultivate it and tap it and bring it to the purpose of human betterment. That's really important. Third, we have to understand politics and power, because in certain cases there really are people opposing, and they pay off the politicians or they do other things, and we have to be aware of that. It's not all rosy. It's actually, there are interests at stake, and I go with the common interest rather than the vested interest. So we should figure out what the broad interest is, not what David and Charles Koch's interest is. And that's a third. And the fourth message is clear. Control ourselves for our own good, cultivate proper decency, learn to be individually responsible to our own futures and to our neighbors and our community, but control our darker forces, because whatever you think is the other, they're thinking the same of you, and there is no other. It's just all of us. And if we can get that straight and keep out of wars, we'll find a way forward. Thank you. I went on longer than I was expecting to, because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but thank you for the chance. But what do you want to talk about? Please.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. So stimulating, so many ideas to take away and to ponder on. Can I just ask about two questions?
Yeah.
What do you feel about the problem of population expansion? When we have a world where 1 million extra people is added to the population every week, is there any hope there, even with technology? That's the first question. The second question, picks up from a lot of what you've been saying. You talk about the scientists on one hand, using rationality, empiricism, and achieving wonders, godlike wonders. On the other hand, you have politics. And we have democracy, yes, and it's a safe kind of system. It's very hard to think of another one, but it's an appalling system. Essentially, imagine science being done by asking the average man what the answer is. It would be crazy. So it's maybe an impossible question, but can you answer those two issues? Population expansion and what kind of political system might be possible to replace democracy?
Great questions. First, on population, we're not adding 1 million a week, we're adding 1.5 million a week. So it's a net increase every year of 75 million people in the world. And we're at 7.5 billion people right now, and we'll be at 8 billion early in the next decade, maybe by 2021, 2022. It's a real problem. You remember Thomas Robert Malthus, who said population's a problem, and he wrote in 1798 the Principles of Population. At the time that he wrote, the world's population was about 850 million people, and now it's 7.5 billion people. So roughly a 9-time increase from them. Good news, worrying news, and a solution. The good news is the rate of population growth peaked and has come down. The peak was around 1970 when the world population then was about 3.5 billion, and the growth rate was about 2.1%. And the average annual increment was 75 million. Today, the growth rate is half of what it was, the percentage growth rate. The population is twice what it was, and the increment is still 75 million because of the multiplication of the two. There's actually only one part of the world that still has open-ended population growth, because in Europe, a little bit less, but basically true in the United States, in China, in most of Southeast Asia, certainly in Japan, in Russia, the population has either stabilized or is declining or is about to stabilize. So there are two places where the population continues to grow. One is India, South Asia in general, but even there with a trajectory that shows a peak, but still a lot of momentum, because India has about 1.3 billion people, and it will peak at about 1.7 billion, and then start coming down. It will overtake China imminently as being the most populous country in the world. China's close to 1.4, India's at 1.3, and it's about to cross. The other region of the world that's open-ended in fertility right now is Africa. So the situation in sub-Saharan Africa is that there were 179 million people in sub-Saharan Africa, all of sub-Saharan Africa, by the UN's count in 1950. Today, there are 1 billion. So it's gone up 5 times. Okay? And the fertility rate in sub-Saharan Africa remains an average of more than 4. And the result is, if you do a scenario based on a gradual decline of the fertility rate, you end up with 4 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa in 2100. My advice to African leaders is don't try that. That's impossible from a development point of view. The continent is 70% semi-arid in a period of climate change. Food plots are already a half a hectare or a fourth of a hectare or a tenth of a hectare in many places in Africa, and the population continues to soar. So that is the only place on the planet where population remains an existential issue in a way. because if Africa were not having that potential population runaway, the world population would peak at 8 to 8.5 billion. Peak by mid-century and then start coming down. A lot of people, but not continuing explosion. So the drama for me on this issue, from many different points of view, environment and population migration and Africa's own development, is turning that fertility rate down. Fortunately, there's an absolutely marvelous, completely proven, decisive, simple, decent way to do it. It's called girls' education. It's basically keep girls and boys, enable them to stay in school to complete a secondary education everywhere. And that fertility rate will go from near 5 down to near 2 in 20 years. And there will still be population momentum because it's a very young age, so a very young population, so that young population will be more numerous than their parents' population size right now. But then it will stabilize. And so Africa's population is either going to stabilize around 2 to 2.5 billion, or it's going to find itself near 4 billion. And my advice to African leaders, and I give it all the time, is do everything you can for many, many reasons to keep the kids in school. Not to mention that there are no decent jobs in this world anymore if you don't have at least a high school education, because the machines are taking all the kind of work that used to be done by raw labor. Even agriculture in Africa, smallholder agriculture, will be all mechanized. So there are no jobs without a decent education, and there's no prospect of sustainable development with 4 billion people. And I say to European leaders every day, and I'll be in Brussels next Wednesday, make a special fund to help African countries fund secondary education. It's a no-brainer. What possibly could you be thinking of not to do that? And I've been saying that every day for the last 3 years, and once a week at least for the last 17 years, and it hasn't happened. And for me, that doesn't matter. I'm going to keep saying it every day until it does happen. Because it's a little bit like my BedNet experience, which was after 7 years, finally one day came and then it just happened. And we need to put aside $25 billion a year, which is $20 per person in the rich world, or by my count, 14 Pentagon days. Or if you want to do it another way, it's the salary of maybe 20 hedge fund managers. There are just a lot of different ways to do long division. But they all show this is nothing when hundreds of millions or billions of people's lives are at stake. So I'll go to Brussels next week and they'll explain to me it's very hard. Why don't you go to Berlin and talk to the chancellor and do this? And okay, we'll keep doing that until we get an answer. And the African leaders, I'm urging that next January at their African Union Summit, that they announce free secondary education, as Ghana's president just did, but say, please help us. Help us financially so that we can really make this happen. And this is not a hard problem, but it's an urgent problem. So then on the question of politics and democracy. What can one say? First, our systems can work, but they're not guaranteed to work. But democracies can do wonderful things and have built wonderful societies. and at times have acted in a very glorious way. And I also talked in my lecture on Monday about my favorite president of the U.S., who I think was the greatest we ever had, Franklin Roosevelt. So he was elected 4 times by the American people. I can't even tell you how my parents and grandparents loved him, because but I understand it now as an adult because I've studied him up and down, and the genius and the decency and his wife's decency and genius were unbelievable. And I gave an example that amazed me that I just read last week as I was preparing an essay. In 1944, in the height of the war, when the war could be seen to be coming to a right conclusion, Roosevelt sent a letter to his military science advisor, Vannevar Bush. And it's just, you read it and you say, that's greatness. Because the letter said, Dear Dr. Bush, we have accumulated all this scientific knowledge in the military. It's all secret. What should we do after the war to make it known to the world so it could be used for civilian purposes? And what could we do to promote our capacity to solve problems of disease, for example, drawing on the great science that we've created? I raise that because, first of all, it may seem, so what's so special about that? But a leader that says, how do we make our secret great knowledge public? It's already unbelievably rare. That's a 1 in a million leader to begin with. But he understood what he wanted was a decent society, not a war machine. And so Bush wrote a fabulous essay. I'd add it to your reading list, but this is optional. It's called Science, the Endless Frontier. And it was an essay in 1945 back to the President of the United States. Here's what we should do. And he envisioned how science could work in a democratic, open, free society for human betterment. And he invented ideas which for us were things like the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation and so on. And of course, England had them 2 centuries before in a somewhat different guise, but like the Royal Society and the Royal Academy of Engineering and all these wonderful institutions that were to solve social problems. So when you read that, you remember that it's not always dunderhead sociopaths. It's sometimes great leaders that just are elected and they're loved by the people because they're trying to do decent things. And then, you can recall Beveridge here in the war and building a welfare state after the war and building NIH, or my first love in politics is Scandinavian social democracy, because I think it's just an incredibly humane, wonderful, decent system that Sweden, Norway, and Denmark invented starting around 1910 and then put into effect systematically from 1930 till now. And they show you can be rich, you can be prosperous, you can be fair, you can be open, you can be honest, and you can be democratic. And so it's kind of proof of concept, like a mathematician. Is it possible? Yeah. Spend a day in Sweden, it's wonderful. And I like a lot of places, by the way, but that's one of my favorite places. So I don't believe this is beyond us, but human adventure is open-ended. And there's never a moment of where you say, okay, we've solved it. And there's never a moment of victory, finally. There's only the day-to-day victories. Stop the sociopaths, promote the good ideas, fight like heck, keep going. And at least the open societies allow that to happen. And we really need to champion that and not lose heart, because we can make these institutions work, and we're blessed with so much knowledge. You just go around town here from UCL and LSE and all the universities within a few blocks of here. It's unbelievable how much knowledge there is. And it's not so far from Whitehall, and it's not so far from the kind of problem solving that needs to be done. So I believe it's within reach. But then these terrible accidents happen, and we have a real fight on our hands in the United States. And when I say the things I do, it's not to get a laugh and not to get a rise. I'm afraid. This guy's really dangerous because he's out of his own control. This is a mentally ill person who needs help. And the Oval Office is just not a great place for that. It's not a calming place. It's not a low-pressure environment. And it's not a place, we don't want to learn by doing with all the accidents involved. So we really have a fight on our hands that's no joke. And we're that close to disaster with North Korea. And that's not just two people screaming at each other. Just like I'm sorry to be depressing, but it's true. I've spent a lot of time reading about a lot of things, but mainly about World War I, as I described, and about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Cold War. And it's always so close to an accident. And unless you have that sense of tragedy deeply inside, you're prone to that accident. And the reason that we survived the Cuban Missile Crisis was John F. Kennedy's humanity, that he realized at the gut how close we were to disaster. And he had a sense in the gut that Khrushchev was feeling the same thing. And so it was maturity of two people. It was actually Khrushchev and Kennedy, surrounded by people who kept telling, shoot first, shoot first. And both of them figured out, no, don't shoot at all. We'll get out of this. And that's really frightening with this guy, because he has none of that self-control. It's the opposite. He's according to one psychologist I'm reading today, he's a present hedonist, malignant narcissist, sociopathic personality trait. You take your choice. But anyway, you don't want it in the Oval Office. Please. Yeah.
Thanks for the lecture. I have two questions. So whilst governments around the world are disappointing us, what role do you think companies, and in particular the financial services industry, can play in society? And the second question is, when will we see you running for president?
See me what?
When will you run for president?
Oh, yeah, right. I'm not sure I would carry the vote of my own household. You have to ask my wife. But on the financial services industry, finance, there are two kinds of finance, fundamentally. Three kinds of finance, okay? So one kind of finance is help take people's savings, diversify it to reduce their risk, or invest it in insurance or diversified portfolios as a risk management part. That's a fundamental and important role of finance. Second role of finance that I think is a kind of glorious role is take people's money, have a vision of the future that needs to be built, and invest the money to help build the future. And that's what great bankers have done in history. Not just have been rich, but they've seen the future and they've invested in it, and they've helped to put in the capital for the new industries. And a third kind of finance is take people's money, gamble it like hell. If you win, take it home with you. If you lose, tell them that they lost all their money. And that's called Wall Street right now. You know, Wall Street is a gambler's den of hedge funds that make a lot of money on the upside and walk away with no loss on the downside. The loss is to their investors. So it's a kind of gamed gamble, not a hedge. And it's not anything about the future. It's all betting. And so finance has this good side, a very good side, and a very bad side to it. And we succumbed in 2008 to the bad side. We had a crisis because there was so much leverage that basically banks were borrowing and gambling other people's money, and they gambled into a real estate bubble. And when the bubble burst, not only did they lose the money, but a financial panic ensued when Lehman Brothers failed on September 14, 2008. And we ended up with $20 trillion of wealth going up in panic. So have we learned from this? Not very much. A bit more here than in New York, where we still have our investment banking industry mainly as traders, and not traitors, but traders. And Goldman Sachs has basically run the economic policy of the White House for 20-some years. It's a little tiring. All right, send the next one. So we have this useless Steve Mnuchin, and we have this useless Gary Cohen, and they're just not nice people in positions of responsibility, so they're bringing the worst of finance in. I've spoken to some of our leading bankers, and there are a few good and important ones. Why don't you lead the financing of solar energy, wind energy, sustainable technology? Why don't you lead the way in building the future like your predecessors did 100 years ago in building rail, steel, and the industry of 1900? That's what the financial industry should do. There's a lot of investment, trillions of dollars that need to be invested in zero carbon energy, in a grid system that can shift to an all-electric vehicle system, and new public transport, and so forth. And that's the real role of finance. So we need bankers who stand up and talk about sustainable development, and that's the business of the future, and that's the business of banking, and that's the business of investing. And you have a wonderful insurance leader here named Rowan Douglas of Willis Re, who has said the role of the insurance industry is to help address and counteract the worst of human-induced climate change. So that's what finance should be: build the new economy of the future.
Thanks a lot. Folks, I feel terrible to come on stage and interrupt this, but we do promise to try and let people, especially those who have come a long way, get away in time. And I know Jeff also needs to get away. Jeff, I'm struck by a couple of really important things. First of all, I sense personally, and I suspect many others here, are just very glad that people like you are out there bringing these vitally important messages to really seriously influential people. So thank you for that. Secondly, I was so moved by the us and them reference and the power of that, and that statement you made about there really isn't any them, it's all us together. And I guess the central premise of Action for Happiness is that we can't necessarily change all the conditions of the world, but we can change our own, attempt to change our own response to it. And of course, in cases like yourself and Richard and others, there are people who have genuine influence at a global level that can make a big top-down difference. But many of us in this room don't necessarily feel we have that power, but we do sort of feel that we have the ability to be less of an us and them person, to treat others well, to spread these values. Do you have faith, and can you give us perhaps some hope that those individual actions and that cultural change does matter, both historically and in terms of how we live now? Do you think that is true alongside all this top-down stuff that is needed?
I'll just tell you one thing, which is that Sonia and I have had the chance to work in every culture and every part of the world and every race and every income level, and there really is no them. It's the most wonderful feeling, actually, that you can walk into a village anywhere of people that are, they don't speak a word of your language, different race, different religion, different everything. And the human contact and the goodwill is overpowering. And I've never felt anything different from that anywhere in the world. And it's interesting because we've worked in a lot of places where you're told, don't do that. And I'm not saying there aren't dangerous places, and I stay away from those, and I'm not good at war zones, by the way, so there's no heroism here. I'm just saying that the experience of working with people is that there is no reason for any of these divisions. There's no one that hates us for what we are. There's no one. This is all made up by these crazy impulses in our head or by politicians who play on them. And politicians, some either intuitive ones or really evil ones or manipulative ones, play on it, either because that's their instinct or because they're absolutely psychopaths. But that's not the true state of the world. So in that sense, I'm very optimistic. And what we have to help ourselves and help others is to understand we carry with us that gene of the hard tendency. We're not immune to it, any of us. We constantly have to check ourselves. We're all bigoted. We're all categorizing. We're all identity driven. This is really deep. But it's completely wrong and it's completely controllable. And it needs to be cultivated. And it needs the face-to-face experience. And that, I think, is the wonderful thing. And for those of us lucky to live in places like London or New York, we have that all the time because we're living in diverse settings where you meet everyone all the time. And in New York, if you hear English, it's, oh, somebody spoke English. That's an odd occurrence. And it's just absolutely a wonderful thing. But we have to convey that idea. Let me end, if I could, just with my favorite quotation by President Kennedy, who I love as a leader because he saved the world and then helped push it towards peace. And he spoke exactly about this issue in the most beautiful way, so final homework assignment, and this one is mandatory. He gave a speech June 10, 1963, that came to be called his peace speech. And it was a speech to motivate Americans to make peace with the Soviet Union. A very unusual speech, because it wasn't saying to the Soviet Union one word, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. He said to the American people, let us re-examine our own attitudes towards peace, for our attitudes are as important as theirs. So it's a unique speech in American foreign policy, saying it's about us, not about them. So he was making the case we can make peace, and his whole idea was that it's humans on the other side. And so there's nothing which fundamentally divides us. It's this wonderful instinct. So he said, so let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and to the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. and we are all mortal. Thank you. Thanks.